The Nebraska plains stretched endlessly under the October sky of 1886, dust swirling around the small train station where Serafina Rossetti clutched her son's hand with trembling fingers. 8-year-old Angelo pressed against her worn traveling dress, his dark eyes wide with uncertainty as they watched the other passengers disappear into waiting carriages. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. 3 months of correspondence with Cornelius P. Barnaby had led to this moment, but now only empty prairie greeted them. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant smoke, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the mournful sound of wooden wheels creaking across hard-packed earth. Her last $23 weighed heavy in her coat pocket, not nearly enough to return to the squalor of New York's tenements. "Mama, where is the circus man?" Angelo whispered in Italian, tugging at her sleeve with the innocent trust that had kept her fighting through 2 years of widowhood. Sarah smoothed his unruly black curls, her calloused hands once graceful enough for the ballet stages of Milano, now rough from factory work and survival. Through Cornelius's letters, she had imagined painted wagons and exotic animals, a life of wonder that could give Angelo the childhood she'd dreamed of but never provided. Instead, the horizon offered only endless grass bending under an indifferent sky, and the growing certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. The station master emerged from his small office, eyeing them with the suspicious look reserved for foreigners and the obviously desperate. "You folks waiting for someone?" the man asked, his weathered face creased with concern as the afternoon light began to fade toward amber. Sarah forced herself to stand straighter, summoning the poise that had once carried her across European stages, though her voice wavered when she spoke. "Mr. Cornelius Barnaby, he was supposed to meet us here. We are to be married." The station master's eyebrows shot up, and he scratched his graying beard thoughtfully before pointing toward a thin column of smoke rising from beyond a distant ridge. "Might be him," he said slowly. "Saw some circus wagons head that way yesterday, but they looked mighty empty to me." Angelo's face lit up at the word circus, but Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized their carefully planned new life might already be crumbling before it began. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. They walked the dusty mile toward the smoke, Angelo chattering excitedly about lions and tightrope walkers, while Sarah's mind raced through increasingly desperate possibilities. As they crested the small hill, her breath caught in her throat at the spectacle she had imagined, but at the profound sadness of what lay before them. 3 faded red wagons sat in a rough circle around a dying campfire, their paint peeling and canvas covers torn, while a massive man in a bowler hat, small for his head, sat staring into the flames with the defeated posture of someone who had lost everything. This had to be Cornelius, but where were the performers, the animals, the magical world he had described in his carefully penned letters? The only movement came from an enormous man splitting firewood nearby, each swing of his axe carrying the rhythm of resignation. "Mr. Barnaby," Sarah called softly, her voice barely carrying over the wind as Angelo pressed closer to her side, suddenly uncertain. The man by the fire looked up with startled gray eyes that held depths of kindness beneath their current despair, and she recognized the gentle soul whose letters had convinced her to risk everything on this journey westward. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over a tin cup that clattered against the stones, and Sarah could see him taking in her travel-stained appearance, her son's wide eyes, and the reality of what he had promised but could never deliver. Mrs. Rossetti, he stammered, his voice carrying the refined accent of education mixed with the rough edges of frontier disappointment. You shouldn't have come. I should have written again, should have told you." His words trailed off as he gestured helplessly at the empty wagons, and Sarah felt the last of her carefully constructed hopes begin to crumble like autumn leaves. The giant man with the axe approached them slowly, his massive frame moving with surprising gentleness as he removed his cap to reveal kind blue eyes set in a face marked by years of honest labor. "This is Tiny Pete," Cornelius said with forced cheerfulness, though his voice cracked on the words. "Pete, this is Sarah, and Angelo, was it?" The boy nodded solemnly, and Pete knelt down to Angelo's level, his enormous hands steady as he carved a small wooden horse from a piece of firewood with quick, practiced strokes. "Nice to meet you, little man," Pete said in accented English, his Polish heritage evident in the rolling consonants. "Your papa wrote us many letters about you both. Sarah watched this gentle exchange while her mind frantically calculated distances, train schedules, and the terrifying arithmetic of their dwindling resources, knowing that whatever had happened here had left them all stranded in the middle of nowhere, with winter approaching. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Cornelius finally began to explain the catastrophe that had befallen his small traveling circus. Madame Volkov, he said, spitting the name like a curse into the growing darkness. She came through 3 weeks ago with her grand operations team Calliope, trained tigers, a whole troupe of European acrobats, offered my people twice what I could ever pay. His voice grew hollow as he continued. One by one, they packed their things and left with her, until it was just Pete and me, sitting here with empty wagons and debts I can't possibly repay. Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her as she listened, the same feeling she had experienced in the moments before, stepping onto a stage when all the fear transformed into focused determination. Angelo had fallen asleep against Pete's shoulder, trusting in the way children do, and she realized that running back to New York was no longer an option. They would have to find a way to make this impossible situation work. So you're asking me to marry you and help you with a circus that no longer exists, Sarah said quietly, her words cutting through the crackle of the fire with the precision of a blade. Cornelius winced and nodded, unable to meet her eyes, while Pete shifted Angelo to a more comfortable position and watched them with the careful attention of a man who had seen many dreams die. Yes, Cornelius whispered, I'm a fraud and a failure, and I've brought you and your boy into my disaster. Sarah stood up and walked to the nearest wagon, running her hands along the painted wood that still held traces of its former glory-faded stars and moons, a prancing horse whose tail had been worn away by weather and neglect. But beneath the damage, she could see the craftsmanship, the love that had once gone into creating this mobile world of wonder. Show me what's left, she said firmly, turning back to face Cornelius with eyes that had learned to see possibility in the midst of despair. Inside the wagons, Sarah discovered the remnants of a lifetime's collection of theatrical magic costumes that needed mending but still held their jeweled beauty, rigging equipment that could be repaired, and most importantly, a complete set of hand-painted backdrop canvases depicting exotic locations from around the world. Pete had been quietly maintaining everything, his massive hands surprisingly delicate as he oiled hinges and patched tiers with the devotion of a man who understood the value of dreams. Your people may have left, Sarah said, holding up a spangled costume that could fit her with minor alterations, but they left behind everything needed to create new magic. Cornelius looked at her as if she were speaking a foreign language, but Angelo stirred in Pete's arms and murmured something about flying in his sleep. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of excitement that preceded every performance, the sensation of standing at the edge of something magnificent. I was a dancer, Sarah said simply, and in those 4 words, Cornelius heard the first note of hope that had sounded in his world for months. She moved to the center of the wagon and, despite her exhaustion and travel-stained clothes, began to demonstrate the fluid grace that had once captivated audiences in European opera houses. Her arms flowed like water, her spine curved with the memory of countless hours at the bar, and even in the dim lamplight, she transformed from a desperate immigrant woman into something ethereal and powerful. Angelo has been watching performers his whole life. He moves like poetry when he thinks no one is looking. Pete's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn, and he shifted the sleeping boy gently to see the natural athleticism in his relaxed limbs. We may not have exotic animals or famous acrobats, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, but we have something else entirely. Cornelius felt something long dormant stirring in his chest as he watched Sarah transform the cramped wagon into a stage with nothing more than her presence and passion. What do you mean? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer from the way she moved. The way she looked at the performance equipment not as abandoned relics, but as tools waiting to be used. In every town, there are ordinary people with extraordinary talents they never get to show the world, Sarah said, her eyes bright with possibility. The blacksmith who can bend iron into art, the minister's wife who sings like an angel, the children who dream of flying. What if we didn't just bring a circus to them? What if we made them part of the circus? Pete set Angelo down on a pile of soft costumes and clapped his huge hands together quietly, the sound like distant thunder. Community circus, he said, in his careful English, nodding eagerly. People become the show. The idea hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. As the prairie night settled around them, complete with stars that seemed close enough to touch, Sarah made her choice with the same decisive grace that had once carried her through a grand jeep. "I'll marry you, Cornelius Barnaby," she said, extending her hand with formal dignity. "Not because I need rescue, but because together we're going to build something that's never existed before, a circus that belongs to everyone it touches." Cornelius took her hand with trembling fingers, and she felt the calluses that spoke of honest work despite his current circumstances. Angelo woke up just enough to wrap his small arms around both their legs, as if sealing the pact with innocent trust, while Pete began pulling bottles and bread from his seemingly endless coat pockets. They were no longer strangers bound by desperate correspondence, but partners embarking on an adventure that would either destroy them all or create something magnificent. In the distance, a coyote called across the plains, and Sarah heard in it not loneliness, but the sound of wild freedom calling them forward into the unknown. The morning brought their first real test when they rolled into the tiny settlement of Cedar Hollow, population 47, where the residents emerged from their sod houses and wooden storefronts to stare at the peculiar sight of 3 battered circus wagons led by such an unlikely family. Sarah, now wearing a hastily altered costume that transformed her into something between a princess and a gypsy fortune teller, walked beside the lead wagon while Angelo rode on Pete's shoulders, both of them waving to the curious crowd with the infectious enthusiasm of born performers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cornelius called out in his rich ringmaster's voice, which seemed to grow stronger with each word, "welcome to Barnabas Community Spectacular, the circus, where you are the stars." The townspeople exchanged skeptical glances, but Sarah noticed how their eyes lingered on the painted wagons, and she recognized the same hunger for wonder that had driven her from the ballet studios of Milano to the stages of 3 continents. Within an hour, they had set up their modus ring in the town's main square, using hay bales borrowed from the livery stable and every available lantern to create a magical circle of light. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah moved through the growing crowd with the instincts of a born performer, her trained eye picking out potential, the young woman whose graceful walk suggested natural rhythm, the blacksmith whose massive arms could surely support amazing feats of strength, the group of children who moved with the fearless energy that every acrobat remembered from childhood. "Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to fly?" she asked a shy girl of perhaps 12, and watched amazement bloom across the child's face as Sarah demonstrated a simple ballet lift that made her seem to float for just a moment. Pete worked quietly in the background, his enormous hands crafting juggling balls from sawdust and fabric scraps, while Cornelius discovered that his talent for organization could turn chaos into choreography with surprising speed. As the sun set behind the prairie, something magical began to happen in Cedar Hollow's dusty Main Street. The blacksmith, whose name was Thomas, found himself lifting volunteers above his head with the same ease he used to handle his anvil, while his wife, Mary, discovered that her church choir voice could fill the entire square with haunting beauty. Sarah guided 3 farm children through basic tumbling passes, their natural fearlessness combining with her technical knowledge to create moments of genuine wonder. And Angelo, shy for the first time in his life, slowly joined in when he saw other children his age attempting the acrobatic moves he had been practicing in secret for months. "This is what circus really means," Sarah whispered to Cornelius as they watched a 60-year-old storekeeper learn to juggle with surprising dexterity. Not exotic animals or death-defying stunts, but ordinary people discovering they're capable of extraordinary things. Cornelius felt tears prick his eyes as he realized she was creating something he had never imagined possible. By the time the impromptu performance reached its crescendo, with Thomas lifting Mary above his head while she sang Amazing Grace, and the children formed a human pyramid that swayed gently in the lamplight, Sarah knew they had found their new identity. The people of Cedar Hollow pressed coins into Cornelius's hands, not charity, but payment for an experience that had transformed their ordinary Tuesday evening into something they would remember for the rest of their lives. "When are you coming back?" Little Emma, the shy girl who had learned to feel like she was flying, asked Sarah with tears in her eyes. "We'll circle back this way in the spring," Sarah promised, though she had no idea if that was possible. As they packed up their equipment under the starlight, helped by townspeople who seemed reluctant to let the magic end, Angelo finally found his voice. "Mama, are we really going to do this everywhere we go?" he asked in Italian, and Sarah answered in English so their new family could understand. Everywhere, sweetheart. We're going to show the whole world how to fly. The next 3 towns proved that Cedar Hollow had not been a fluke. In each settlement, no matter how small or isolated, they discovered remarkable talents hiding behind the facades of ordinary prairie life. In Millville, they found a German immigrant who could play hauntingly beautiful music on glasses filled with water, while his twin daughters possessed an almost supernatural ability to move in perfect synchronization. Prairie View revealed a former cavalry officer who could perform trick riding that rivaled anything Sarah had seen in European circuses, and a seamstress whose quick fingers could create costumes that transformed farmers into kings and housewives into queens. With each performance, Sarah's confidence grew, and she began to see patterns: how music could unite a crowd, how physical comedy could break down social barriers, how moments of genuine beauty could make even the hardest frontier faces soften with wonder. Angelo thrived in this environment, his natural athleticism blossoming under Sarah's guidance and Pete's patient encouragement, while Cornelius discovered that his true talent lay not in managing professional performers but in seeing the hidden potential in every person they met. It was in the town of Sweetwater that Sarah experienced her moment of complete emotional commitment to this new life. When a young mother approached her after the show, with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, "I haven't felt beautiful since my husband died 2 years ago," the woman whispered, still wearing the sparkling shawl Sarah had wrapped around her shoulders for her solo dance. "Tonight, for just a few minutes, I remembered who I used to be." Sarah embraced the woman, feeling the profound responsibility of the gift they were offering: not just entertainment, but transformation, hope, and the radical idea that everyone deserved to experience their own magnificence. That night, as they camped under the vast prairie sky, Cornelius took her hand and spoke the words that made their partnership complete. "I love you, Sarah Rossetti, not just as my wife, but as the person who taught me what circus really means." Angelo curled between them in their shared blanket, and Pete's gentle snoring from the next wagon provided a bass note to the symphony of crickets and distant coyotes. For the first time since Giuseppe's death, Sarah felt truly at home. Their growing success, however, had not gone unnoticed by less friendly eyes. As they prepared to enter the larger town of Mill Creek, a rider intercepted them on the dusty road, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Marcus Killian, business manager for Madame Volkoff's Imperial Circus. "You're trespassing on our territory," he said with cold authority, his pale eyes taking in their humble wagons with obvious disdain. "Madame Volkov has exclusive rights to perform in this region, and she doesn't appreciate amateurs cutting into her profits." Sarah felt Cornelius tense beside her, and she could see fear beginning to cloud his newfound confidence. But something fierce and protective rose up in her chest. "Since when does anyone own the right to bring joy to people?" she asked, keeping her voice level despite the anger building inside her. Killian smiled without warmth and tipped his hat, but his parting words carried the weight of a threat. "Madame Volkoff will be interested to hear about your little hobby circus." Very interested indeed. That evening in Mill Creek, their performance began under a shadow of tension that Sarah couldn't quite shake. Though she threw herself into the show with even more energy than usual, they had attracted their largest audience, yet nearly 200 people had gathered in the town's central square, drawn by word of mouth from neighboring settlements and the tantalizing promise of becoming part of something magical. Sarah guided a local fiddle player and a surprisingly graceful rancher's daughter through an improvised dance that told the story of the prairie's changing seasons, while Pete worked with a group of teenage boys to create a strongman act that showcased both his incredible power and their youthful enthusiasm. Angelo, now completely at ease with performing, served as the bridge between acts, his natural charisma and bilingual chatter delighting the crowd. But as the evening progressed, Sarah noticed a small group of well-dressed strangers watching from the edge of the crowd, taking notes and whispering among themselves with expressions that suggested they were not there for entertainment. The strangers revealed themselves during the finale, when the entire audience had joined hands in a circle around the ring, singing along to a folk song that Mary from Cedar Hollow had taught them. A woman stepped forward from the group, tall, elegant, and radiating the kind of authority that made crowds instinctively step back. "Touching," she said in a voice accented with Russian overtones, her pale green eyes taking in the scene with calculating coldness. though I'm curious why you're stealing my former employee's material." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized this had to be Madame Volkov herself, and she could see Cornelius backing away from the confrontation with the defeated posture she had hoped never to see again. "These people aren't performing your material," Sarah said, stepping forward to place herself between Volkov and her new family. "They're performing their own stories, their own dreams." Volkov laughed, a sound like breaking crystal, and gestured toward the painted wagons. "In stolen equipment, using techniques I perfected, in territory I've claimed. How? Quaint." The confrontation escalated quickly when Volkov's men began photographing their equipment and making a detailed inventory of their belongings, claiming that everything from the rigging to the costumes had been acquired under suspicious circumstances. The townspeople of Mill Creek watched in confusion as their magical evening dissolved into accusations and legal threats, and Sarah could see the doubt creeping into their faces as Volkov's polished professionalism contrasted sharply with their humble operation. "You have 48 hours to dismantle this pathetic imitation and leave my territory," Volkov declared, her voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Otherwise, I'll have the authorities seize everything and arrest you for theft." Angelo pressed against Sarah's side, frightened by the woman's cold authority, while Pete's massive hands clenched into fists that could have solved the problem with violence but wouldn't, as Volkov swept away with her entourage, leaving behind the wreckage of their evening. Sarah realized they were facing an enemy who would stop at nothing to destroy what they had built. That night, camped on the outskirts of Mill Creek, they held a desperate council of war while Angelo slept fitfully in Sarah's arms. "She's right about the equipment," Cornelius said miserably, staring into their small fire with the hollow expression of a man watching his dreams burn. "Technically, the performers own shares in everything, and when they left, Pete's voice rumbled like distant thunder as he interrupted. "Equipment not important. Heart important. Soul important." But Sarah could see the legal reality crushing down on them like a physical weight. They were immigrants and outsiders with no resources to fight someone of Volkov's obvious wealth and influence. "We could go back east," Cornelius suggested without conviction. "Start over somewhere else." Sarah looked at her sleeping son, remembering the light in his eyes when he performed, thinking of Mary's soaring voice and Thomas's gentle strength, and all the ordinary people they had helped discover their extraordinary potential. "No," she said quietly, but with the steel that had carried her through Giuseppe's death and 2 years of grinding poverty. "We don't run, we fight." The next morning brought an unexpected ally when Thomas the blacksmith appeared at their camp, his weathered face set with determination, and his wagon loaded with supplies. "Mary and I talked all night," he said simply, "and we decided we're not letting some fancy woman from back east tell us we can't have our circus." Behind him came more wagons, the fiddle player from Mill Creek, several families from Cedar Hollow who had ridden overnight, and a dozen other performers they had worked with in previous towns. "Word's been traveling," explained Emma's mother from Prairie View. "Folks are saying Madame Volkov's trying to shut you down, and that don't sit right with people who remember what you did for us." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized their community circus had become exactly that, a real community that would fight to protect what they had built together. Angelo woke up to find himself surrounded by friends, and his delighted laughter rang across the prairie, like a bell announcing the dawn of something unprecedented. But Volkov's response to their growing support network was swift and ruthless. By afternoon, sheriff's deputies had arrived with official-looking papers, claiming that several of their painted wagons matched descriptions of equipment reported stolen from various circuses across the Midwest. "We know it's nonsense," Thomas said angrily, his massive blacksmith's arms crossed as he faced down the nervous lawmen. "But they've got papers, and papers carry weight even when they're lies." Sarah watched in helpless rage as the deputies began confiscating their wagons, their costumes, and even Pete's beloved woodworking tools, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and Angelo's small carved horse. Volkov herself appeared to oversee the seizure, her smile cold and triumphant as she watched years of Cornelius's work being loaded onto official wagons. "Perhaps this will teach you the difference between professional entertainment and amateur theatrics," she said directly to Sarah, her pale eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "The frontier is no place for European pretensions." The gathered townspeople watched in stunned silence as their circus was systematically destroyed by the power of money and legal manipulation. That evening, sitting in the gathering darkness with nothing left but each other and the clothes they wore, Sarah faced the darkest moment of her adult life. Angelo cried quietly against her shoulder, not understanding why the bad lady had taken away all their beautiful things, while Cornelius sat with his head in his hands, whispering apologies that couldn't undo the disaster. Even Pete seemed diminished, his enormous frame somehow smaller without his tools and the wagons he had maintained with such loving care. "I should never have written to you," Cornelius said brokenly. "Should never have dragged you into this impossible dream." The prairie stretched empty around them, and Sarah could hear the distant whistle of a train that could carry them back to the tenements of New York, back to the grinding poverty and broken dreams they had fled. For a long moment, she seriously considered surrender, taking Angelo's hand and walking away from this impossible situation before it destroyed them all. But as she held her son close and listened to his exhausted breathing, Sarah remembered something. Her dance instructor in Milano had told her years ago, "La magia non vive negl'oggetti, cara mia, vive in chi la crei." Magic doesn't live in objects, my dear, it lives in those who create it. Slowly, she stood up and walked to where their small fire cast dancing shadows on the prairie grass, and began to move. Without music, without costumes, without any of the trappings they had lost, she danced, and in that dance was every story they had told, every moment of wonder they had created, every ordinary person who had discovered their extraordinary potential. "They can take our wagons," she said, her voice growing stronger with each step. "They can take our costumes and our props and our painted backdrops, but they cannot take what we know, what we've learned, what we've built in people's hearts." Angelo stopped crying to watch his mother transform darkness into light with nothing but her movement, and Cornelius felt something broken inside his chest beginning to heal. "We start over," Sarah declared, turning to face her family with eyes that blazed like stars, "but not the way Volkov expects. We don't try to recreate what we lost, we create something entirely new." She gestured toward the town lights of Mill Creek, where windows glowed warmly against the prairie night. "Every person we've worked with, every town we've visited, every moment of joy we've created, that's our real circus. That's what she can't steal or destroy." Pete's deep voice rumbled with growing excitement as understanding dawned. "Mobile community, living circus, no wagons, no equipment, just people and magic." Cornelius looked up from his despair to see Sarah silhouetted against the stars, her dancer's posture conveying a strength that no legal papers could diminish. "But how?" he asked, and she smiled with the fierce joy of someone who had just discovered the solution to an impossible problem. "We're going to do what circuses have never done before. We're going to travel without traveling, perform without equipment, and create a show that exists only in the moments when people choose to make magic together." The next morning brought their salvation in the form of Mary, the blacksmith's wife, who appeared at dawn with a wagon loaded with supplies and a proposal that would change everything. "Thomas and I have been talking with folks from all the towns you've visited," she said, her church-trained voice ringing clear across the morning air. "We've got a plan, if you're willing to hear it." She spread out a hand-drawn map, showing the network of communities they had touched, with careful notations about distances, populations, and the specific talents they had discovered in each location. "What if we created a circuit?" she continued, her eyes bright with possibility. "Not you traveling to us, but us traveling to each other. A rotating festival where each town hosts the others, sharing what you taught us." Sarah felt her heart leap as she grasped the revolutionary nature of the idea. Instead of a circus that performed for passive audiences, they would create a network of active communities that performed for and with each other. Angelo clapped, his hands in delight as he understood they weren't losing their circus but expanding it beyond anything Volkov could imagine or destroy. The plan that emerged over the next few hours was both brilliant and completely unprecedented in the history of American entertainment. Each town would prepare their own acts based on what Sarah and Cornelius had taught them, then travel in rotation to perform for the other communities, creating a constantly evolving festival of prairie talent. Cedar Hollow could host in November, Mary suggested, pointing to dates on a carefully drawn calendar. Prairie View in December, Mill Creek in January when the weather's coldest and folks need the most cheering up. Thomas had already begun designing portable stages that could be built from local materials, while the German twins from Millerville had composed a song that could serve as their collective anthem. But the most remarkable part was the arrival of Jim Crawford, the former cavalry officer, leading a delegation from 3 towns they hadn't even visited yet. "Word spread about what you've been doing," he said, his weathered face creased with genuine admiration. "Folks are saying you created something that brings communities together instead of just taking their money and moving on. We want to be part of that." Sarah realized they had accidentally created something that transcended entertainment, entirely a network of connected communities, celebrating their own potential. However, their growing success attracted Volkov's attention in ways they hadn't anticipated, and her response was more sophisticated and dangerous than simple legal harassment. A week later, as the first inter-community festival was being planned for Cedar Hollow, strange accidents began plaguing their network. Hay bales collapsed during rehearsals. Props mysteriously broke, and several key performers received urgent messages calling them away on family emergencies that later proved to be hoaxes. "She's trying to break us apart from the inside," Cornelius realized as they surveyed the damage at what should have been a dress rehearsal. Sarah watched Angelo practicing his tumbling routine with determined concentration, seemingly unaware of the adult tensions swirling around him, but she could see the fear creeping back into Cornelius's eyes. Pete had taken to sleeping outside their lodging, his massive frame serving as both guard and statement, but even his intimidating presence couldn't protect against sabotage and psychological warfare. "She knows she can't destroy what we've built with legal papers," Sarah said grimly, "so she's trying to make us destroy it ourselves." The crisis reached its peak on the morning of Cedar Hollow's festival, when they discovered that someone had poisoned the well that supplied water to the performance area, forcing the entire event to be relocated with only hours' notice. As Sarah helped organize the frantic move, she overheard conversations that chilled her blood, people questioning whether the circus was bringing more trouble than joy, wondering if it might be better to quietly abandon the project before Volkov's harassment escalated further. "Maybe she's right," she heard Thomas's wife whisper to another woman. "Maybe we're just simple farming folks trying to be something we're not." For a terrifying moment, Sarah could see their entire network collapsing under the weight of fear and doubt, all their work dissolving like sugar in rain. Angelo sensed her distress and slipped his small hand into hers, looking up with the absolute trust that had sustained her through their darkest moments. "Mama," he said in his careful English, "the magic is still here. I can feel it." His certainty cut through her panic like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. That evening, as the relocated festival struggled to find its footing in an improvised venue behind the church, Sarah made a decision that would either save or destroy everything they had built. She walked to the center of the makeshift ring, raised her hands for silence, and began to speak in a voice that carried across the gathered crowd with the clarity of trained projection. "Madame Volkov thinks she can destroy what we've created by making us afraid," she announced, her words rippling through the audience like stones thrown into still water. "She thinks our community circus is just another business to be eliminated, another competitor to be crushed. But she doesn't understand what we really are." Angelo appeared at her side without being called, followed by Pete, then Cornelius, then Mary and Thomas, until their core family stood united in the lamplight. "We are not a circus that happens to involve communities," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We are communities that have chosen to create magic together, and that is something no amount of money or legal manipulation can destroy." The crowd stirred restlessly, and she could see doubt warring with hope in their faces as they waited to hear what she would ask of them. "Tonight," Sarah declared, her trained performer's instincts telling her this was the moment that would determine everything, "we stop running from Madame Volkov and start running toward our own future. Tonight, we perform not despite her efforts to destroy us, but because of them. Tonight, we show her hand ourselves that community is stronger than commerce, that creativity is more powerful than control, that ordinary people choosing to support each other can create magic that no amount of money can buy or steal." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch across the entire prairie. And for a heartbeat Sarah thought she had pushed too hard, asked too much. Then Angelo began to clap, slowly and steadily, and Pete joined him with his massive hands, creating thunder, then Cornelius, then Mary and Thomas, until the entire crowd was applauding not just her words, but their own decision to keep fighting. As the festival finally began in earnest, with every act performed with defiant joy and every audience member participating as if their lives depended on it. Sarah felt something fundamental shift in the air around them. They were no longer just performing despite adversity, but transforming that adversity into the very source of their strength. Madame Volkov's long-anticipated challenge arrived not through lawyers or threats, but with the overwhelming spectacle of her imperial circus. She brought gilded wagons, exotic animals, and professional performers, setting up directly across from the Prairie family's modest stage. With a commanding voice, Volkov forced the townspeople to choose between real entertainment and the humble efforts of farmers. Sarah, watching from behind the church, felt her heart sink as families drifted toward the dazzling circus, her community's fragile unity starting to unravel before her eyes. Then Angelo, Sarah's 8th son, unexpectedly stepped forward. Without fear, he began tumbling joyfully, not with trained acrobatics but with pure childlike freedom. His authenticity stopped the crowd in its tracks and drew them back from Volkov's spectacle. One by one, Sarah, Cornelius, Pete, and the Prairie Troop joined him. Soon, local children and visiting kids filled the square, their spontaneous laughter and play overshadowing the cold precision of Volkov's performers. Mary's voice rose in song, and the adults followed, turning the confrontation into a celebration of shared gifts and love of performance. The decisive moment came when Maria, one of Volkov's young acrobats, left her stage to join the children, teaching them with genuine joy. Despite Volkov's furious protests, more of her troupe followed, inspired by the Prairie family's warmth. The two circuses blended into one, leaving Volkov isolated on her grand platform. Defeated, she ordered her wagons to leave, but nearly half her troupe stayed behind, rediscovering the true heart of circus. Angelo, radiant and draped in Maria's scarf, declared, "We all won," as the townspeople and performers celebrated together until dawn. In the weeks and months that followed, the Prairie Circus evolved into a cooperative unlike anything seen before. Professional artists and farm families worked side by side, teaching each other and performing with sincerity rather than for profit. Through winters, they sustained themselves with kitchen circuses, intimate gatherings that deepened bonds. By spring, word had spread beyond Nebraska, and what began as survival had grown into a movement, reshaping ideas of art, community, and entertainment. Sarah, once a desperate outsider, had become the director of a cultural revolution, her family and community proving that true power lies not in competition but in collective creativity.